come with me now. Come with me now. I'm gonna take you down. Come with me now. I'm gonna show you how. Come with me now.
Well, hello class. Today we're going to learn about the money market and then how banks actually create money. So this is all kind of interwoven with our knowledge of the Federal Reserve as well. So to introduce all of this, I want to show you all a new graph that y'all are going to be drawing. This is called the money market graph. So the graph I have already created on the right hand side of the screen. I should probably label it or title it. It's called the money market. So the money market is another graph similar to the loanable funds market that shows us what interest rates are. Okay, now this one's a little bit different. This one shows the nominal interest rate versus the loanable funds market that shows the real interest rate. Anyway, the whole point of all of this though is that the Federal Reserve conducts monetary policy by controlling the size of the money supply. So basically, if the Fed wants to lower interest rates, they will increase the size of the money supply. And so I have shifted that curve to the right, and it creates a new equilibrium along the demand curve at a lower interest rate. So anyway, the Federal Reserve might want to do something like that if they would like to see more economic activity in the economy, so maybe in a recession, okay? Because lower interest rates would increase investment spending, as well as it could entice people to go buy new cars and houses and all kinds of stuff, which would increase aggregate demand. So that's kind of the second thing that's been going on with the coronavirus, is the Federal Reserve has ramped up their bond buying, which increases the money supply. All of this is stuff you're going to learn next class, but it's all going to kind of come together as we learn this piece by piece. Anyway, there's your introduction to the money market. Now, we're going to move on and we're going to split it apart and kind of talk about both the supply curve and the demand curve. Okay? So to start, the demand for money, okay, that's that downsloping curve. It is made up of an asset demand as well as what we call a transaction demand. So when we talk about this, what we're referring to is the money that we need in order to carry out our everyday transactions, like when we buy stuff. Okay, that's the transaction demand. And then the asset demand is the demand we have for money just to hold on to. Okay, now I'm going to explain that in greater detail as we move forward. Just be aware that the demand curve is really just us and our desire to either hold money or have money to spend. Okay, the supply curve, that is a vertical line, as you can see in the graph. And the reason it's vertical is because the Federal Reserve determines how big the money supply is, and they don't have motivations to supply more money at higher interest rates or less money at lower interest rates. Their desire is actually to change the money supply curve in order to change the interest rates. So we draw that one as a vertical curve. Okay, and then like I said before, nominal interest rate goes on the y-axis, and then just the quantity or the quantity of money goes on the x-axis. All right, so there's that. And y'all can read what's written on this screen. It's all kind of important, and it explains what we're about to do. All right, so let's look at the transaction demand for money first. And I don't want this to confuse anybody, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the transaction demand also as a vertical curve. Okay? And the reason the transaction demand is vertical is because we as consumers, we demand a certain amount of money so that we can pay our bills. Okay, so I listed all my bills over here. I got the mortgage, I got some car payments, insurance, groceries, utilities, blah, blah, blah. Please note the Valentine's pizza is a real thing. There was once upon a time on Valentine's, I asked the wife what she wanted for Valentine's, and her response was, "Oh, I just don't want to cook." I'm like, okay, so I brought home a pizza. It turns out that was not what I was supposed to do. So that's just another lesson for you human males. For Valentine's, you don't bring home a pizza. Okay? Anyway, I've got this whole list of things that I need money for. So my transaction demand curve for money is around $3,720 a month. And guess what? if prices go up, I would actually need more money for transaction purposes. Okay? So the transaction demand curve, while we're not really going to draw it separately from the asset demand, if it were a separate curve, it would be vertical because it is dependent upon what things cost, basically. Okay? So let me put some little notes here. This is the transaction demand is basically our M1 money. Okay, remember the way the Fed measures the money supply, they have M1, which is basically the money we keep in our wallets and in our checking accounts. Okay, it is independent of the interest rate. Okay, it makes no difference what interest rates are. I still need $3,720 to pay my bills, and so that is my demand for money for transaction purposes. And then you can also relate this demand for money as medium of exchange money. So there's a lot of ways to describe it. All right, but just be aware, as our nominal income or nominal GDP rises, so do prices. And that is what creates an increase in demand for money, is higher prices. Okay? So I don't expect this to be completely crystal clear at this point. I think as we move on, we're going to look at the asset demand, and then we're going to put them both together. At that point, it should click as to an understanding of what we mean by transaction versus asset demand. Okay? So just hold on. All right, here's our asset demand. Now, asset demand is money that we don't need for our daily, weekly, monthly transactions. Okay, this is just money we hold on to in case we see something we want to use it for. All right, so I want you to think of asset demand as holding money in your hand. Okay, now we probably don't literally do that, but compare holding money in your hand versus keeping your money in the form of a bond. Okay. If you keep your money in the form of a bond, that means you're not holding money. Okay, you're actually holding a bond, in which case you would have less demand for money as an asset. So I want you to think of asset demand as literally just holding it in your hand. And the reason you're going to hold it in your hand is because you currently don't have anything better to do with it. Okay? So the asset demand curve is downsloping. Okay? And the reason it's downsloping is because at low interest rates, so let's say interest rates are what they currently are, which is about 0%. Okay? If interest rates are 0%, you have no incentive of putting your money in a bond. I mean, why go to the trouble to earn 0% interest? So you're probably going to hold more of it. And so that's why at low interest rates, the asset demand for money is greater. Okay? The quantity demanded is greater. But what if you could earn 20% in a bond? Would you hold as much money in your hand, or would you put it in that bond? Okay, so this is describing why the demand for money curve is downsloping, because at low interest rates, we're going to demand to hold more money. Okay, at high interest rates, we're not going to hold the money. We're going to put it somewhere to earn the high interest rate. And so that's a description of why the asset demand for money is downsloping. All right, again, this could still be confusing, so don't worry about it. We're going to put them both together now to kind of have a clearer understanding of what the demand for money is made of, okay? So remember, we have our transaction demand for money, okay, that's the money we spend, and we have our asset demand for money, okay? When we put these two together, it's going to give us this total demand for money curve, okay? So let's do this on the next slide and answer some questions as we do it. All right. So first, I want to point out that at the 10% interest rate, okay, I hope everybody sees this. At the 10% interest rate, I drew a little dot on our transaction demand curve. There is $100 demanded, okay, 100 billion. At the 0% interest rate, there's also 100 billion demanded for transactions. That's because it doesn't matter what interest rates are, we still need a certain amount of money to buy the things we have to buy. Okay? Now, let's add to that the asset demand. Okay, at 10% interest, there's going to be zero money demanded for assets because at that high interest rate, we're going to put our money to work in a bond. Okay, at 5% interest, we're going to demand 100 as an asset. Okay, so we'll hold more of it. And at the 0% interest rate, we'll hold 200. So if we add these two curves together, okay, the transaction demand and the asset demand, at the 10% interest rate, 100 is demanded for transactions and 0 is demanded for assets. So at 10%, the total demand for money would be 100 billion. Okay, let's look at 5%. At 5% interest, transaction demand is 100 billion. Asset demand is also 100 billion. So at 5% interest, 200 billion is demanded. Okay, so I got my little dot. And finally, at 0% interest, we're going to demand 100 billion for transaction purposes, but 200 billion as an asset. So at 0%, our total demand is 300 billion. And so this is our demand for money curve. It is downsloping because of the asset demand for money. Okay? So let's answer these questions real quick just to review some things. Okay, first of all, whenever you see the term nominal GDP, that indicates that there's a change in the price level. If there is a change in the price level, then you're going to demand more money for transactions. So that transaction demand curve would end up shifting to the right, and then so would the total demand curve for money. Okay? At numbers 2 and 3, we really already answered. Okay? At the equilibrium 5% interest rate, the amount of money demanded for transactions would be the 100 billion, and the amount demanded as an asset would also be 100 billion. Okay? That's these 2 points here. Okay? If the interest rate were 10%, we still need 100 billion for transactions, but now we're only going to hold 0 for assets. Okay? And the reason this asset demand curve slopes downward is because at lower interest rates, it decreases the cost of holding money. Okay? If I hold all my money in my hand when interest rates are high, then it's costing me that interest rate to hold the money in my hand. At lower interest rates, it doesn't cost me as much. All right, so we're going to shift gears now. So that was the first little complicated thing for today's lesson. The second complicated thing is an understanding of how banks create money. Okay, and we're going to do that right after we do this practice-free response. Okay, so the reason we're doing this is because I want you all to see how you might be questioned to demonstrate your understanding of the money market graph. Okay, so this one says, assume that declining stock market prices in the U.S. cause many U.S. financial investors to sell their stocks and increase their money holdings. That actually happened here in the last month. Okay, in case you're not hearing this video in a timely fashion, it is currently April of 2020, and because of the coronavirus outbreak, a lot of investors sold their stocks. Okay, so we're going to draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the impact of those financial investors' actions on each of the following. All right, so this is our money supply curve. This is our demand for money curve. We've got quantity and I've got interest rates. Okay, now notice this question is specifically asking us about the demand for money. Okay, so I could put my money in the stock market or I can hold on to money. Well, if I put it in the stock market, that means I don't have very much demand for money as an asset. But if I'm selling the stock, then I'm demanding more money as an asset. So what this actually does is it causes the demand for money to increase, which means it shifts to the right. And then notice what that does to the equilibrium interest rate. Okay, it is increased. So the demand for money goes up, interest rates go up as a result of that. All right, let's move on and talk about something different. Okay, we're gonna look at. I'm gonna have you read a story. Okay. Normally we would do this popcorn style, but because we're not in class, we can't really do that. So I will quickly read it to you. All right. Once upon a time, there was a goldsmith who offered to store people's gold in his vault. He issued paper receipts for the gold, and it was not long before the townsfolk used the paper to purchase eggs and beer. The smith's paper receipts, the first checks, became as good as gold, because they were basically gold. All right, our smith was not stupid. He said to himself, I have 2,000 ounces of gold stored in my vault, but in the last year I was never called upon to pay out more than 100 ounces in a single day. What harm could it do if I lent out, say, half the gold I now have? I'll still have more than enough to pay off any depositors that come in for a withdrawal. No one will know the difference. I could earn 30 additional ounces of gold each week in interest. I think I'll do it. Here's the important part. Okay, the goldsmith invented the fractional reserve banking system. So here's a demonstration of the fractional reserve banking system. All right, this is the banking system we currently have, and when you put your money in the bank, this is exactly what happens to it. All right, so we're going to deposit $20 with a 20% reserve requirement. What that means is your bank must set aside 20% of that deposit as reserves, okay? So here's what happens. 20% goes into reserves, okay? That means they can't touch it. It goes in the vault, whatever, okay? But the other 80%, that is now available for loans. And so basically what happens is your bank is going to set aside $4 as reserves, that's 20% of the 20, and it's going to loan out the other 16. Okay? That is what is meant by a fractional reserve banking system. So we're going to learn how banks create money by doing exactly what we just described. Okay? So first, let me remind you, when we talk about the money supply, we're talking about currency. Remember, that's paper notes and coins, plus the demand deposits of the public. Okay, demand deposits are checking accounts. Don't forget that. Checking accounts. Okay? Right, so first we've got to learn a little terminology. All right, this is in your notes. You can just fill in the blanks basically, but these are all very, very important. Okay? In fact, these definitions are so important that you will not understand what we do after this unless you know these definitions. So keep them handy. Fractional reserve banking system. We just described that. That is where a fraction of deposits are held in reserve and the rest are loaned out. Okay? The term vault cash is referring to the amount of currency that a bank has. They usually keep it in their vault. Required reserves. All right. This is the dollar value of what the bank is required to keep in reserve. From our example, we had a 20% reserve requirement with a $20 deposit, so the required reserves would be the $4. Okay? $4. Next, reserve requirement. This is the percentage of demand deposits that may not be loaned and must be held in reserve. So from our example before, the reserve requirement was 20%. Okay. Number 5, reserve ratio. This is the reserve requirement expressed in decimal form. That's actually going to be important because we're going to use it in decimal form when we start calculating changes in the money supply. Okay? Oh, before we move on to number 6, please note that 3, 4, and 5 all have the same initials. So when we abbreviate these, you're going to see that they all 3 are going to be abbreviated as RR. That could be confusing if you don't understand their context. Okay, number 6, excess reserves. This is the dollar value of reserves a bank holds above the required reserves. Okay, what's very important here is that excess reserves are what a bank is allowed to loan. Okay? All right, number 7, actual or total reserves. This is the total amount of money, of cash money rather, a bank owns. Okay? They keep what they own in currency as vault cash plus on reserve at the Fed Bank. Okay? And number 8, we're going to learn about the money multiplier. Sometimes called the deposit expansion multiplier. Both are correct. It doesn't matter what you call it. It tells you how much bigger the money supply can get. All right? And we are going to go over the calculations in a sec. All right, and then the last thing, balance sheet. In another class, we're going to learn about balance sheets, but it's basically how banks account for all of their transactions. Okay? So let's move on. Notice the classical painting, creation of Adam. It's not really that. It's the creation of money. And so we're going to go through all of these equations in their English definition so we will fully understand this stuff. All right? So let's pretend I deposit $1,000 with a 20% reserve requirement. what we're going to do is we're going to go through what that means in terms of these equations, okay? So here are some English words to explain the equations, but I'm going to go through them one at a time. All right, so the abbreviation TR, this refers to total reserves. If you'll remember from our definitions, total reserves is the total amount of cash that a bank owns. And remember, they keep it in their vault, and they keep it on reserve at the Fed. There's another relationship, though, and that is that our total reserves will always equal our required reserves plus our excess reserves. Okay, so let's see how we apply this. If I make a $1,000 deposit, that $1,000 becomes part of the bank's total reserves. Okay, from that $1,000 deposit, 20% of it must be set aside as required reserves. So $200 goes there, and then that leaves $800 as excess reserves. Okay, so that's all from a $1,000 deposit with a 20% reserve requirement. Next, there is a term called potential money creation, or possible money created. Okay, that's PMC. PMC is equal to the money multiplier times the excess reserves. So from my $1,000 deposit, we already calculated that there were $800 in excess reserves. The money multiplier, let's look down at the bottom equation. That is found by taking the number 1 and dividing that by the reserve ratio. So if I do 1 divided by 0.20, I get 5. So the money multiplier is 5. So this is where the magic happens. That means when I make a $1,000 deposit, potentially the money supply could grow by another $4,000. Crazy, right? Well, that's what that means. That means the total money supply, that's TMS, total money supply can be the 4,000 that was created plus the original deposit of 1,000, which means the total money supply could grow by $5,000. Or I'm sorry, the total money supply could be 5,000. It grew by 4,000. So that's kind of a quick explanation of the math behind money creation. We're actually going to go through some examples so you can see how this really works. Okay? So again, if you don't understand this so far, that's okay. Just write it down, hold on to it. It's gonna become more clear. All right, so here's an example. All right, let's say Ron Swanson deposits $5 in his bank, okay, and the reserve requirement's 20%. What that means is $1 of the $5 goes to required reserves. Okay, $4 goes to excess reserves. This is where it's important, okay? That means that $4 can be loaned out, okay? So they can loan out $4 in loans. If they do that, then those $4 in loans can multiply through the banking system 5 times. Why 5? Because 1 over 0.2 gives you 5, and that's the money multiplier. So 5 times 4 would be $20. So potentially, if Ron Swanson makes a deposit of $5, the money supply could grow by another $20. Okay? That's just a quick example of how we're going to apply this. Now, I do want to go over one more thing so that we don't get confused, because later on, we're going to see that banks get money from other sources. Okay? Banks don't just get their money from deposits. Sometimes they borrow money from the Fed, and that money is going to be treated differently. Okay? So here's how it's different. If Ron's bank gets money from the Fed, that is not a deposit. And reserve requirements only apply to deposits. So from that $5, 0 of it goes to reserve requirement, all of it goes to excess reserves. Which means if the bank gets money from the Fed, they can loan out all of that money. Okay? Which means their loans can go up by $5, which would also multiply 5 times through the money market. And so the potential money created could be $25. Now, that's probably a little confusing. The main thing I wanted you to get out of that is that if a bank gets money from the Fed, $0 goes to reserve requirements. That's the main key there. Okay? We're going to do a lot more examples until this really makes sense. Okay? So let me show you how it works in practicality. Okay, we're going to pretend that Gary deposits $1,000 in his bank. Okay, so I'm going to make the $1,000 deposit. It goes right there. The reserve requirement's 20%. So $200 goes to required reserves. That leaves $800 as excess reserves. So that means Gary's bank can loan out $800 so that Tom can borrow it so that he and Donna can go have a treat yourself excursion. Okay, so the new loans possible was $800. Now here's what happens. That $800 gets deposited into another bank. Okay? So now the second bank has $800 in deposits. Of that, 20% has to be set aside as required reserve, so $160 goes there. Okay? That leaves $540 as excess reserves, which means $540 can get loaned out to somebody else. Who borrows it? Leslie, so she can make some new scrapbooks. Okay? By the way, someone said that she would have a binder on how to remedy the coronavirus. I don't know if that's true or not. Anyway, that $540, guess where it goes? It goes into another bank. Okay? And maybe I should get out the old calculator here. Make sure I'm doing this right. Actually, is it 540? Wait a minute, it's 640. I'm a knucklehead. Hopefully y'all didn't screw this up like I did. There we go, 640 and 640. Got it fixed. Okay. So the required reserves on a $640 deposit is $128. That means, and I'm going to use my calculator. I don't want to screw this up. 640 minus 128. 640 minus 128 equals 512. Okay. So that's how much can be loaned out. Now, one thing that I haven't talked about yet is a description of how all these loans end up making the money supply bigger. So can I pause for a second and show you something? Remember, the money supply is currency plus demand deposits, which are checking accounts. Okay? So before there was any deposits anywhere, Gary had $1,000 in his pocket and $0 in his checking account, so the money supply was $1,000, right? Well, as soon as he made a deposit, okay, at that point, there was $0 of currency and $1,000 in his checking account, which means money supply was still $1,000. But when that $800 got loaned out, now you got $800 in currency, but Gary still has $1,000 in his checking account. Because just because the bank loans it out doesn't mean you don't have the money. And so the money supply gets bigger. So really, the big takeaway there is that when all these loans get made, the money supply gets bigger. That's what's really happening. Okay? And the whole purpose of the math is to demonstrate how much the money supply can get bigger. So this $512 loan that Ron took out so that he could get a turf and turf meal, that gets deposited, into another bank. Okay? And that $512, $102.40 gets set aside as required reserves, and $409.60 gets put as excess reserves, which means $409.6 can be loaned out. Okay? Who borrows it? Ron again, so he can buy all the bacon and eggs that you have. All right, so basically, this process would continue on and on and on and on and on until there was $0 loans possible. Okay? Now, this is the cool part. If you were to add up all of these required reserves, okay, as it continued, okay, eventually, this column would have added up to $1,000 because it would be all the currency that exists. The only currency in this system would be the required reserves and all the bank vaults. Okay? Those excess reserves, those are the things that created the loans, And the new loans possible, that actually is the potential money created. And so that column is going to add up to $4,000. Why? Because PMC is equal to the money multiplier times the excess reserves. The excess reserves I'm talking about would be the $800 that was initially loaned out, and the money multiplier is 1 over 0.2 because of the 20% reserve requirement. And then all of those deposits, all of those guys, those are going to add up to $5,000 because that's the total money supply. So really the entire money supply is going to be, if this happened and every bank loaned out as much as they possibly could, then the total money supply would just be all the deposits. Okay, the currency would not exist because it's all in vaults. Okay, currency is only currency if it's in circulation, but it's all in vaults. So basically that's how this system operates. Now it's very unlikely that this much money would actually be created because a lot of people hold those loans as cash. Not everybody puts all their money in the bank. Okay, not all the banks loan out all of their excess reserves. So this is the potential money created. So that's what is meant by all of that. Now, this is probably still confusing, so we're going to do some more examples. All right, so here's one. Just practicing the math real quick, okay? So we have another deposit. This time it's a deposit of $1,000 still. But in this case, the reserve requirement is 50%. So that means $500 goes to required reserves. $500 goes to excess reserves, which means $500 can be loaned out. Because remember, new loans possible and excess reserves, those are always the same number. Okay? So practicing our math. Total reserves is going to be the amount of money the bank now has, which is $1,000 from the deposit. The required reserves we just stated were $500. The excess reserves was also $500. If we didn't know one of those three numbers, then we would definitely be able to figure out one of them because the total reserves always equals the excess reserves plus the required reserves. So don't forget that. New loans possible is always the same number as the excess reserves. Okay, so these two guys are always the same. Okay, the money multiplier is 1 over 0.5, which is 2. The potential money created is going to be the money multiplier times the excess reserves. So for us, that's going to be 2 times 500, which is 1,000. And then the total money supply is the potential money created plus the original deposit that started it all off. And so in our example, we would get 1,000 that was created plus the $1,000 deposit for a total money supply of 2,000. Okay? So that's just a quick practice of the math. We're actually going to apply this in a way that uses word problems, so you really have to know it. Now, remember when I told you that Ron's bank got money from the Fed that one time? Let's see how that affects it. Okay? First, total reserves, that $1,000, it does become part of the bank's total reserves. Okay? But none of it is required reserves because it is not a deposit. So remember, required reserves only applies to a deposit. That means the entire 1,000 goes to excess reserves. Okay? Now don't forget, that's because required reserves plus excess reserves equals our total reserves. Okay? New loans possible is always the same number as excess reserves. Now the money multiplier it's still going to be calculated by using the reserve requirement. So in this example, it's 1 over 0.25, which would be 4. PMC is still money multiplier times excess reserves. So in this case, it'd be 4,000. And then our total money supply is still, now pay attention to this, it's PMC plus the deposit. But there was no deposit. So the total money supply is 4,000 also. Okay? Now, I'm sure you're probably figuring out that this can be really, really confusing. So I want you to really pay attention to the word problems we're about to go over because that's what's going to help you. Okay? So we'll get to that in a second. First, I wanted to very quickly point out something to you. Now, in our last example, the reserve requirement was 25%, right? That means the money multiplier was 4. When the reserve requirement was 50%, the money multiplier was 2. When the reserve requirement was 20%, the money multiplier was 5. And if the reserve requirement's 5%, that means 1 over 0.5 is 20. So hopefully you've noticed that when the reserve requirement gets smaller, the money multiplier gets bigger. Okay, that's going to be important. Something else to note, and that is this. Okay, a lot of people will have this question when banks loan out your money and your money's no longer there, will it be there when you go to get it out? Well, hopefully, but the problem is that it might not. So I don't know if y'all, now hopefully y'all have seen this movie. Okay, maybe we should watch it.
No, but you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
All right, so that was called a bank run, okay? A bank run is when everybody goes to the bank to get their money out at the same time, and because 90% of it was loaned out, it won't be there for us. Now, we don't see bank runs anymore, and the reason we don't is because during the Great Depression, deposit insurance was created. And so today, if your bank were to go out of business, your money is safe because it's insured. Okay, it's insured up to $250,000. So that's why we don't have bank runs anymore. So I just wanted to throw that in there because a lot of times people have that question. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do some examples, probably just the 10, probably these 10 questions, I think 7, 8, 9, 10. That's as far as we're going to go. The rest are review examples. So what we're going to do is that we're going to answer these 10 to help us out. And then you can do the homework to make sure you understand it. All right, so it says here that excess reserves prior to a new currency deposit is $0. So banks have no money to lend right now. But then Katy Perry deposits $40 million with a legal reserve requirement of 20%. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure we understand that when a deposit is made, the money supply doesn't change. It's only when a loan is made that it changes. So let me show you. Remember, money supply is currency plus deposits. So when Katy Perry had $40 million in her pocket and 0 in her checking account, the money supply was $40 million. Okay, when she moved the currency from her pocket into her checking account, the money supply is still $40 million. Okay, so does that make sense? Hopefully it does. So remember, currency is only currency when it's in circulation. All right. Now, how much can Katie's bank loan out from her deposit? So let's make sure we make a note here. Reserve requirement was 20%. Okay. And total reserves is always equal to required reserves plus excess reserves. So her $40 million becomes part of the bank's total reserves. Of that, 20% must be set aside as required reserves, so that's $8 million. That leaves $32 million as excess reserves. If you remember your definition for excess reserves, that is what can be loaned out. So how much can be loaned out? $32 million in loans. Okay? Now, that $32 million, as it circulates through the economy and gets redeposited into other banks, then there is a potential that the money supply could increase by a certain amount. Okay, so PMC is potential money creation. It's found by taking the money multiplier and multiplying by the excess reserves. Our money multiplier is 5. Okay, why? Because it's 1 over 0.2. And then our excess reserves from number 2 is 32. And when I do the math, I think I can do this in my head. Yeah, I'm going to do it in my head. 160 million. Okay? So potentially the money supply could grow by an additional 160 million. Maybe I should double check that. I don't want y'all to get confused if I did the math wrong. Yeah, I did it right. Good. All right, so number 4. After the increase, the total money supply will be, well, this is where you just add back in the initial deposit. Okay? So total money supply is going to be the 160 created plus the $40 million deposit for a grand total of $200 million. So what you're going to be required to do is calculate change in the money supply when a deposit is made or when the Fed buys bonds or anything like this. Okay? Let's look at another example. All right. So number 5 says, the Second National Bank has excess reserves of $6,000 and demand deposits of $100,000. What is the size of the bank's total reserves if the reserve requirement is 25%? So you have a best friend when trying to calculate these things, and it is that equation. The one that says total reserves is equal to required reserves plus excess reserves. If you can fill out that equation as much as possible with the information given, you will get all the answers. Okay? So we're trying to calculate total reserves. We don't know that yet. However, we were given excess reserves, right? 6,000. And we were given that the reserve requirement is 25% and that deposits are 100,000. What that means is the required reserves has to be 25% of the deposits. So 25% of 100,000 is 25,000. And when we add those together, what do we get? 31,000. And that's the answer. Okay? A lot of times we try to make this really complicated, and it's not. Now, I will show you one thing that people get confused about, and you might be having this question. Why isn't the total reserves $100,000? Well, the reason it's not is because that $100,000, a substantial part of it must have been loaned out. Okay, so total reserves is just the amount of cash a bank has. It's not the amount of deposits. Now, when a deposit is made, it goes to the total reserves, but once that gets loaned out, it's not any longer part of the total reserves. So the second question here, number 6, it's asking us how much they have already loaned out. So let's pretend for a second that the 100,000 was just deposited. If it was just deposited, in that case, total reserves would be 100,000. And then 25,000 would have to be in required reserves, which leaves 75,000 as excess reserves. Okay? Remember, excess reserves can be loaned. Okay? So if excess reserves went from 75,000 to 6,000, or if total reserves went from 100,000 to 31,000, that means the difference between those is what has already been loaned out. Okay? So $69,000 in loans have already been made. Now, if you don't get that, rewind and watch that again and pay attention, because remember, what can be loaned is part of our deposits. Okay? And part of our deposits is the excess reserves. So excess reserves can be loaned out. So just try to keep that straight. All right, number 7. This one should be a little more straightforward. Caitlin deposits $1,000 in a bank that has a reserve requirement of 10%, the maximum possible change in the dollar value of that bank's loans. Okay? So when she makes a $1,000 deposit and a 10% reserve requirement, that means 90% of that deposit can be loaned out, which is $900. Okay? Now, the banking system can create more money. So the potential money created by the banking system is going to be $9,000. Why? Because 10 is the multiplier and 900 is the excess reserves. So 9,000 is the potential change in the money supply, which means the total money supply could become as high as $10,000, which, remember, TMS, that's the potential money created plus the original deposit. That's 9,000 plus 1,000. Okay? All right, let's look at these next ones. All right, number 8. Suppose a commercial bank has demand deposits of $100,000 and the reserve requirement is 10%. If the bank's reserve requirements or required reserves rather, and their excess reserves are equal, then what is its total reserves? All right, so we know that the required reserves have to be 10,000 because it's 10% of the deposits, right? And if these two are equal, then excess reserves also has to be 10,000. So what must the total reserves be? 20,000. You just add it up. Okay? So these little word problems, they can be tricky if you don't make them simple. Okay? You're always given the information you need. We just sometimes overcomplicate it because we're looking at it from a distance instead of dissecting these important terms. Okay? Those things there is what allows us to get the answer. All right, number 9. Suppose the Big D Bank has deposits of $500,000 and a reserve requirement of 10%. If they have excess reserves of $4,000, what is its total reserves? So on this one, first of all, here's how we get, whoops, let me stop that. There we go. These two terms are going to allow us to get the required reserves of 50,000. And then we have excess reserves of 4,000 because we were given that. So total reserves, 54,000. Okay? And then finally, if excess reserves in a bank are $4,000 and demand deposits are 40,000 and the reserve requirement is 10%, its total reserves must be, so again, in case, whoa, what the heck? In case this is confusing, we always spell it out with our equation. Okay, reserve requirement is 10%, so 10% of 40,000 is 4,000. And it has 4,000 as excess reserves. So its total reserves must be 8,000. All right. So the rest of these review questions you can answer by looking in your notes. What I will do is very quickly give you the answers, but this is basically the end of the lecture for the money creation class. All right, let's look at the actual answers real quick. I think number 13 requires a little bit of explanation. So remember, transaction demand is the money we need for transactions, okay? So if we have $300 that is demanded for transactions and every dollar is spent 3 times, then our GDP will be 3 times 300. So that is how all 3 of those numbers are related to each other. This is actually something we did at the beginning of class, and actually number 21 is similar to number 13 on the last page, so I'll give that one another explanation. So every dollar demanded for transactions spent 4 times. That means GDP must be 4 times the amount that is demanded for transactions, so it would be 400. Okay? These are really just definitions. And that's the end. So make sure you do the homework. Okay? It's actually 5-3, I believe. So get that done. Okay?
Come with me now. Come with me now.